Okay, as people are joining, I think we'll get started because we have a full hour ahead. So thank you everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining the Care for Caregivers webinar. Today's webinar will provide you with a strategy for making it easier to participate in difficult conversations and respond to difficult questions that often arise in healthcare. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So if you're experiencing any technical issues during the presentation, please send an email to webinars@safecarebc.ca and someone will be able to assist you. Also a reminder that this webinar is recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards on the Care for Caregivers website. A quick note about our program. So the Care for Caregivers program is a combined initiative with Safe Care BC, CMHA BC, with funding from the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. I want to start by recognizing that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territories of the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people across British Columbia. We thank them for being good caretakers of the land and allowing us to be visitors on the shared territory to do good work. Without taking up too much time, I want to quickly introduce our wonderful facilitator for today. Elizabeth is a palliative care social worker and an educator who has worked in the field for over 30 years. 14 years were spent at Victoria Hospice, where she worked as a clinical counselor on the community crisis team. She also spent many years working with the research team at the University of Victoria. And without taking up any more of your time, I'll hand it over to Elizabeth. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here today and sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
You are okay to share your screen. Looks good.
Okay, here we are. And I want to just welcome all of you, myself, to What to Say When You Don't Know What to Say, and to share a strategy with you that's called VERS, V-E-R-S. And those letters stand for validate, explore, respond, and share. And right now I'm not moving.
Oh, okay. Do you want to click the bottom arrow on the left-hand corner of your screen where there's an arrow? Right?
Yeah.
The other way. The other way. Try
the other way. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. That'll work. So here's the strategy verse. But before we get into talking about specifically how it works, I'd like to lay some groundwork by talking for a moment about how we tend to define difficult questions and difficult concerns and conversations in the context that we're talking about. Then I want to spend a few minutes just talking about how we tend to listen to difficult questions and concerns. Then we'll look more specifically at how VERS works. We will explore a few scenarios, kind of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and then we'll throw it open to questions and comments. Okay, so the difficult questions and concerns that we generally hear about in the context that we're talking about, healthcare settings, usually have to do with topics around death, dying, illness, perhaps the sudden change in someone's condition, particularly if that's unexpected, loss, grief, and pretty much anything that generates a strong emotional response, especially if that response is unpredictable or unexpected. So what this means is that in the work that you do, there's actually a huge potential for you to come across these kinds of conversations and questions routinely in your work. And yet, if we were to look up the word dictionary, the word difficult in the dictionary, it means onerous, burdensome, to be avoided at all costs, if at all possible. And my concern is that I think that we create and perpetuate a negative attitude toward these kinds of conversations and questions simply by using the word difficult to describe them. However, when they are embraced as a challenging but normal part of the work, then the question becomes not, how do we get better at avoiding these kinds of questions and concerns? The question becomes, what would make it easier for us to do this normal part of the job? And that's where verse comes in, because verse shifts the focus from what am I supposed to say, or what am I not supposed to say, or what am I supposed to do, or what am I not supposed to do, to first asking, what more do we need to understand? What more do we need to understand about this concern, this question, this situation, this person? What more do we need to understand about why this person is having this strong emotional reaction? What more do we need to understand about their history with the healthcare system or their previous experience with the loss of someone close to them? Asking the question, what more do we need to understand first, is about getting into the habit of gathering crucial information before we try to figure out what we're going to say or what we're going to do. Because you see, asking, what am I supposed to say or what am I supposed to do first, can put us in the very difficult position of having to come up with an answer or an action before we have all the information we need to answer or act effectively. And of course, every time we fail at doing that, that just strengthens our motivation to want to try to avoid these kinds of questions and conversations. So that's the first thing. It's changing how we approach these questions, thinking of them as challenging but normal parts of the job. Then I want to say just a few words about what is true about our listening, because none of us are naturally good listeners. None of us are born good listeners. Listening is a skill that has to be learned. And yet research shows us that what most of us learn about listening is that we learn to listen to reply. That means we learn how to listen to say or do something about what we hear. What happens then is that while someone's talking to us, sharing a concern, making a statement, asking a question, our ability to listen is diminished in direct correlation to how hard we're trying to figure out, while they're still talking, what we are going to say or do about what we think we're hearing them saying. Of course, it follows then that the more desperate we are to come up with something to say or do, the less we hear. And I'm sure you can see the irony in this is that our hearing may in fact be most impaired when we most need to be able to hear and understand what is being said. So I'm sharing this little bit of information with you because verse offers a different way of listening, a different purpose for listening, because verse is about listening to understand before we respond. It's based on the premise that when we understand the backstory of the question or the concern, that is the crucial first step in knowing how to respond effectively and appropriately. So with that introduction, let's look at verse and how it works. But before I do that, let me just say, verse is a strategy. It's a template. It will give you some ideas about how you might respond in certain situations, but it is not a script. I will talk to you about some things you might say when answering questions or answering to certain concerns, but it's not about memorizing what I say. It's about finding your own words so that you come across as authentic. So let's start with validating. Validating is about taking the time to acknowledge a person's right to ask a question, to express a concern, and even to have a strong emotional reaction. When we pause before jumping in with an answer or an action and validate the importance of the question being asked, validate the legitimacy of the feelings of the person asking the question, maybe even validate the severity of the situation or just how hard it is sometimes to put things into words. We're saying, I see you, I hear you. Let's start there. And in doing so, I think we take the first step in providing what I would call a healing response that in and of itself can begin to diffuse a situation that might otherwise become difficult. Rachel Remen is an American author, oncologist, and therapist who has worked for decades with people who are dying and the professionals who care for them. And she says, there's a difference between curing and healing. Curing is the fixing of something that's been broken. Healing, she says, happens when someone feels they have been seen and heard and validated. Now, I really like that distinction. And I also think that not enough healing happens in our healthcare settings. We're pretty good at coming up with cures, but I don't think there's enough healing. That act of reassuring a person that they're being seen and heard, and that their questions, their concerns, their hopes, their fears, and their feelings are worthy of being responded to. So healing assumes that there's a reason why people say things, do things, and feel things, and that understanding that reason is a crucial first step in being able to meet them where they are. So we validate someone when we say something like, "That sounds important to you." That's a good question. A lot of people ask that question. "I can hear the pain in your voice. I can see you're really upset by this. Sounds like that was hard for you." Now, of course, validation doesn't always have to be done with words. It can also be a nonverbal demonstration of compassion and healing, such as compassionate touch, with permission, of course. Even silence can be validating if it's accompanied by body language that conveys concern, attention, and a willingness to be fully present in the face of unfixable pain, which of course means not looking at our watch, not looking at the door, hoping that somebody will come in and rescue us or that we'll be magically transported out of this situation. Imagine someone saying to you, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." What could possibly be the right answer to give, the right thing to do to reply to that cry of anguish? Sometimes I think we don't know what to say because there are no words. And that is when being silent and staying in the room, emotionally, physically, and mentally, can be incredibly validating. At the same time, it could also be validating to say, "I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry you have to go through this." Because at least those two phrases mean that you are listening, that you are paying attention, and you're not trying to dismiss or minimize the anguish behind that unfixable pain. Remember, validation does not require you to have the right answer. It does not require you to have some magical way to take away or fix the pain behind what is being said. It's when we feel like we have to say, we have to do something, that we can find ourselves in the trap of doing things like using platitudes, saying to someone, "Well, everybody has to die sometime." Or, "Well, then don't think of that. Don't feel that way right now. For heaven's sakes, you're still here. Focus on what's still good in your life." Or we might fall into the trap of giving false reassurance. "Well, miracles do happen. Just stay positive." The problem with using phrases like this, without it being our intention, is that we can dismiss the unfixable pain instead of validating the person's right to feel it and express it, even though it's uncomfortable for us to see it or to hear it. So we validate because validation is healing. And that takes us on to exploring. Exploring is about seeking to understand what's really happening, what the real issues are behind the concern that's being expressed, what the question is really about. It's about checking out what we think we are hearing to be sure that our interpretation of what we think we are seeing and hearing is actually accurate. Why? Because we know that our own personal filters and biases can actually alter what we see and hear, and also that the primary cause of misunderstandings, especially in emotionally charged situations, is a lack of accurate information and a reliance on faulty assumptions. So let me just tell you a story about myself, about a situation that really could have gone sideways had I not learned over many years through experience, the hard way, of course, to check on situations where I had a strong reaction to what I was seeing and hearing. So for many years at hospice, I was on the palliative response team, which meant going out with a nurse every day into people's homes. So we went out this particular day to a home of a woman we had visited before. She was the patient, elderly woman, and her husband, who was her caregiver. As usual, when we went in, she was sitting on the sofa so she could lean back. He was sitting on a chair across from her, and 2 chairs were set up at the end of the room for the nurse and I. So the nurse began by turning to the woman who was the patient and saying, "So tell me, how's your sleep been lately?" And her husband said, "Well, she doesn't sleep well at night at all. So she takes a lot of cat naps during the day." And the nurse said, "Oh, okay." So she turned to the woman and she said, "So then what's your energy like?" And the husband responded by saying, "Oh, I think her energy is going down every day. It's way less this week than it was last week." Okay, so now the nurse is getting a little bit tense. So she turns and looks directly at this woman and she says, so tell me about your appetite. What has that been like?" And the husband responded. Now the tension in the room was going up. The tension in me was going up because, see, I have issues with controlling men. And that's what I was seeing in front of me. But as I say, I had learned to check it out. So using verse, I validated his experience and the advice or the information he was sharing. I said, your husband seems to know a lot about what's going on with you, and he's very good at sharing that information with us. I just want to ask you, is there anything else that you would want to add to what he's saying, or clarify, or maybe even change what he's saying? And she looked at the 2 of us and she said, "Oh, it's lovely when you girls visit, but my, oh my, you do wear me out with your questions." Well, take one giant step backward and start over. Because what was in front of us was not a controlling husband. It was a loving husband who was protecting his wife from the barrage of questions we so often ask in healthcare. And what was before us was not a controlled wife. It was a grateful wife. But can you imagine the crisis that we would have created if we had put in the chart on the next visit, "Get this woman off by herself so she can answer the questions on her own"? Imagine the crisis we would have created between the 2 of them and with their ability to trust us and work with us. So I think this story demonstrates the incredible importance of exploring so that we can avoid jumping to conclusions based on our own personal baggage, which all of us have, which all of us carry everywhere we go. So we explore when we say things like, "I want to be sure I understand your question. Can you tell me a little bit more about the information you're looking for?" It would be helpful to know what's behind this question for you at this time. For example, is there a reason you're asking this question now? Has something changed? And just leave the question open-ended. Let somebody else fill in the blanks. I want to understand what this is like for you. Can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me a bit more about how you came to this decision? What do you think the change in yourself or your loved one's condition means? Asking a few exploratory questions can also provide crucial information about the patient and the family's history with the healthcare system, as well as their previous experience with illness and death. Why would we want to know that? Because they always bring that with them. They always bring their history with the healthcare system and their previous experience with death and loss with them, and it profoundly affects not only their interactions with us, but their expectations of us. So some possible questions to ask at admission or soon after might be, given your previous experience with the healthcare system, what was helpful? What wasn't helpful? What are your expectations, hopes, fears, and concerns right now, here in this setting? Have you ever experienced the death of someone close to you? What was that like? What did you take away from that experience? What do you want us to know about your loved one or you in order to provide the very best care possible? And then 2 questions I wish that were asked so much more often. What would you say your strengths are as an individual, as a family? What resources have you relied on in the past when you were in crisis? Why wouldn't we want to know that? We know about their illness, we know about their treatments, we know about their family problems. Why wouldn't we want to know about their strengths so we could maximize those? Why wouldn't we want to know what resources they relied on in the past? Maybe we can offer them those resources again. So I'd like to stick with this idea of why it's so important to ask questions to better understand what's behind a question or a concern or a statement by looking at a common disconnect in the information sharing process in which we might assume that information has been shared, but patients and families are saying that they never heard anything. Nobody ever told them anything. I mean, imagine somebody coming to you and saying, information sharing in the health system is terrible. We were always kept in the dark. Now, if you've worked in healthcare for a long period of time, internally, you might be rolling your eyes and thinking, well, that has to be an exaggeration. Everybody gets information. They might not always hear it. They might not always want to hear it, but everybody gets information. But what if we step back from that judgment for a moment and use verse to start by validating? So we might start by saying, Now, is a form of validation. We don't have to say, oh, yeah, gosh, I know exactly what you mean. Says, okay, I'm listening. I hear you. And then we might say, well, it would be helpful for us to know more specifically what didn't work for you. Can you give us an example of a time when you didn't get the information you needed or wanted? What information was missing for you? What were you looking for? And what would have worked better for you in terms of the information sharing process? See, these kinds of questions can get at the heart of what the disconnect is about. And when we do this kind of exploring, we find out things. And we might find out, for example, that the issue is timing. Because we know for a fact that when people are in a crisis, when they're grieving, when they're highly stressed, they don't hear things well. They don't absorb information well. A woman who'd been diagnosed with cancer told me once that when she went into her doctor's office and he gave her the results of her scans, he said, I'm sorry to have to tell you, but you have cancer. And she said, this is what happened after he said that. She said, there's nothing wrong with my hearing. But she said, after he said the word cancer, I didn't hear another thing he said. And then I got up and left his office. So if someone had gone back to that physician and said, for heaven's sakes, didn't you tell that woman what was going to happen next or what she could expect in terms of treatments? The physician would likely say, of course I did. And of course the physician did. but she didn't hear it because she was in crisis. So there was a disconnect in terms of information shared and information received. Another possible reason that people don't get the information that they need is related to the faulty belief that if people, patients and families want to talk about things, especially death and dying, they'll ask. And if they don't ask, they don't want to talk about it. So the authors of the article that's on the screen in front of you decided to do some exploring of their own. So they asked, what more do we need to understand about why patients and families don't ask healthcare professionals questions? And they came up with this research. There were 3 reasons. First of all, people didn't know what to ask. If you've never seen a palliative death before, how would you ever know to ask, what are you going to do when my mom stops swallowing and can no longer eat to keep her comfortable and so she's not hungry? How would you even think to ask that if you had no idea that somebody could possibly stop swallowing and eating days, even weeks before they die? And the second reason people don't ask professionals questions is because they expect the professionals who've been doing this work for years to tell them what they need to know. So you imagine this daughter going to the hospital to see her mom as the nurse walks out of the room with a full tray of food. And she says, wait a minute. Where are you going with that tray? Because my mom hasn't eaten yet. And the nurse looks at her and says, well, your mom's not eating anymore. What? Why didn't somebody tell me that could happen? I mean, if you know that that's a natural part of the dying process, why didn't you prepare me? What are you going to do now? How is she going to be comfortable? Crisis in the making. And the third reason that people don't ask is because they don't want to embarrass themselves by asking for clarification. So one of the things I learned in sitting in many, many family conferences where people were receiving information, quite often in the jargonese, which is the language that we use in healthcare settings so often, that the question that needed to be asked at the end of the information sharing process was not, did you hear what the doctor or the nurse said? Because people would often say, well, yeah, I guess so, hoping they can go home and Google what they thought they heard the person say. The question that needed to be asked was, what did you hear them say? What did you hear them say? And just that little tweaking of the question could make such a huge difference in avoiding assumptions about what people have been told versus what they've heard, and what they've heard versus what they've understood. Maybe you just want to think back on all the crises that could have been avoided by simply tweaking that question. What did you hear the person say? Finally, patients and families may not get the information they need because somewhere along the line, somebody said, don't talk to us about death and dying. Just do not bring it up. We just find that very upsetting. Now, this is when we may think, difficult conversation avoided, check. Okay. But I would advise you not to put that in the chart. Do not chart. Never talk to this family about death and dying. It upsets them because they almost never, 99% of the time, mean never. Okay. So instead, you can use verse. You can start by validating. You say, okay. Okay means I'm here, I'm listening. Okay. Can I just check out a couple of things with you to make sure we don't not have a conversation that you'd actually like to have at some point? So first of all, can I just ask you, are there any conditions under which you would want to have a conversation about perhaps dying, that you would want to have that conversation so that we could go ahead and pursue that? And you can imagine the person saying, well, yes. I mean, if my wife was actually dying, I might want to have that conversation. But see, 3 years ago, they told me she was dying. And then her condition has gone up and down and up and down. And every time she's down, they say, oh, she's dying. And I'm sick of hearing it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Okay. But if this was different, if she was actually, her condition was actually declining, you would want to talk about that. Well, yeah, okay. Can I just ask you one more thing? If that decline was happening faster than you could imagine or would have anticipated, is there anything you'd be doing differently? And the person might say, well, yeah, I mean, there's people that need to visit, there's things that need to get done. Okay, so you actually would want to have that information if that's what was happening. Oh, yeah. See, that's very different than I never, under any circumstances, ever want to have anybody talk to me about death and dying. And again, research shows that when families are asked, if you had a choice between no information at all and bad news, because that's the only news you were going to get, which would you want? They say bad news. Okay, as opposed to no information at all. So remember, verse is about gathering information so that our response makes sense, so that our understanding of what the questions and concerns and statements are really about, because it's what we believe that we are seeing and hearing that determines how we react to people, how we talk to them, how we treat them, how we care for them, and whether or not we help them to feel seen and heard and validated and safe and well cared for. So that takes us to responding. Now, of course, after validating and sharing, a response can be an answer. An answer is a statement. It can be true or false, and an answer may be appropriate, or an action may be appropriate. It may be necessary to take an action to improve someone's condition or to respond to their concern. But a response is also more than an answer, because a response can also be a question for more exploration. So we might say to someone, so after everything you've told me, what do you think? Or we might say, how is all of this for you? What would you like to see happen? Do you have a sense of what's happening right now? Validation or a response can also be more validation. We might say, okay, that's really good for me to know. I now have a much better understanding of what this has been like for you. Or we might respond by saying, thank you for clarifying that question for me. That's really helpful. Now, I want to pause for just a moment here and say something to all the healthcare assistants and personal support workers who may be out there listening. I originally developed Verse for you because in over 20 years of working with healthcare assistants, both as an educator and as a researcher, I had seen so many times when, having been asked a question that was beyond their scope of practice, healthcare assistants were only able to say, oh, I don't know. I'm not supposed to talk about that. That's not my job. So they weren't, they were being very cautious about not going beyond their scope of practice, not saying something that was an opinion or something that was incorrect or not factually correct. So they say, I don't know. The problem is that that answer has the potential to not only dismiss the question without that being the intention, but also to leave the person asking the question to feel unheard and devalued. But more than that, those answers devalue the incredible skills that healthcare assistants have in forming the relationships in which they can gather such useful information to help the team provide the best care possible. So while it's true that answering a particular question may not be appropriate for a healthcare assistant, validating, exploring, and responding, as we're talking about those things here as part of Verse, are all well within a healthcare assistant's scope of practice and can literally determine what an appropriate response looks like. So let me give you an example. Imagine an elderly woman who comes to visit her husband daily in a facility, and he's dying. But every day when she comes in, she brings those tasty little custards that he loves, and she tries to feed him those custards. And every time she does that, he chokes and vomits. But she's so far been pretty resistant to staff getting her to stop. Now, I've witnessed a situation like this in which staff immediately went to, what are we going to say, or what are we going to do? What are we going to say to this woman to get her to stop feeding her husband those custards? What are we going to do with her in order to keep her husband safe? And so they were actually coming up with things like restricting her visits or only allowing her supervised visits, not allowing her to bring any food into the room. But what if someone was exploring with her? Maybe the healthcare assistant who had a relationship with her and her husband began by just some gentle exploration about their marriage, his relationship to food, her caregiving. And what if in the process of that exploring, they found out that in 62 years of marriage, this man was always a big eater. He loved her cooking, never missed a meal, didn't like to go hungry. And that thanks to her fantastic caregiving, which also involved feeding him patiently 3 times a day his favorite foods, she had enabled him to outlive his original prognosis by years. You see, the thing is that once again, when we start by reacting to a difficult situation with judgment, and in this case, potential punishment, we can fail to see and validate what has been going well and to use that as a jumping off point for a positive interaction as opposed to creating a crisis. So, for example, by using verse, we could start by validating her excellent caregiving skills and how well she had nurtured her husband up to this point. And then using that example, we could talk about other ways that she could now nurture him, that she still would do better than anybody else. Lying beside him, kissing him, holding his hand, telling the stories they both know, only the two of them know, playing the music he loves. And then in that very positive environment, we could start to talk to her about why he can't eat anymore and what the staff is going to do to still keep him comfortable and not feeling hungry. Now, will it take a bit of time to overcome her fear that the staff are trying to talk her into starving her husband to death? Because that's what people often believe. Yeah, it could take some time. But working with her as a loving wife who is grieving and worried and afraid of her husband being left to feel the discomfort and extreme pain of hunger, working with her instead as someone who cares will bring her on side far more effectively than labeling her, criticizing her, or punishing her. And I promise you, the crisis that will create will take far, far longer to resolve and undo, if that's even possible. So the point here is that whoever gathers this kind of information and shares it with the team can literally change how care is provided both to the patient and to the family. So let's look at one more example before we look at sharing and then throw this open to questions and comments. Now, I said that, we should look at these questions as challenging questions, not difficult, but you know what? There is a difficult question that gets asked in healthcare. And that question is, how much longer does my loved one have to live? And in fact, it is a question that is often avoided. Now, on the surface, it appears to be a question that's not much different than a question you might ask if you're standing at the bus stop and the person next to you is holding onto a bus schedule and you say, hey, can you tell me when the next bus is coming by? In a similar way, we might look to a physician or a nurse and expect them to have an answer to this question. You know, they're holding the metaphorical schedule, the knowledge of what dying looks like. So can you tell me, how much longer does my loved one have to live? The thing is, though, that how much longer does my loved one have to live is not that kind of a question. It's not a question that is like asking when the next bus is coming. But if we think it's a question that requires a specific answer, that always requires a specific answer, we may find ourselves either trying to guesstimate a time and hope that we're not too far off so that we embarrass ourselves, or saying something like, who knows? I mean, you know, with long-term chronic illnesses and illnesses like dementia, who knows? I mean, they call it the ambiguous dying syndrome because it is so incredibly hard to say when someone is going to die. So I have no idea. The problem is that the first answer is risky, and the second answer is unhelpful, and is dismissive of how hard it can be to even put that question into words. However, using verse, this question is a wonderful example of a question that can be responded to in a way that is both helpful and informative without ever giving a specific answer. In fact, this is exactly the kind of question that verse was designed to address. So we can start with validation. We might say, that's a question many people ask at a certain point in the dying process. It's an important question. It can be a hard question to ask, but frankly, it can also be a hard question to answer. First of all, can I just ask you though, it would be helpful to know what's behind this question for you at this time. For example, is there a reason you're asking this question now? Do you have a specific concern? Has something changed recently? Or, okay. So again, you can just leave that open-ended. But let's think about that. What are some reasons someone might ask this question? So someone might say, well, my husband's dying, but the grandchildren who live back east want to get out here and have one more good conversation with him before he dies. Okay. Somebody else might say, well, I've been sitting in this facility now for several days and I'm wondering, can I just go home and get a shower for a couple hours? Okay. Somebody else might say, well, you know, it really feels like mom has plateaued and we've got this family vacation we've been planning for ages. We're just wondering if we can be away for 2 weeks. Okay. So now you see that once you know the backstory on these questions, they're all very different questions that will need a very different approach and will need more exploration in order to be responded to appropriately. So we're going to get into that. But first of all, you might say, well, let me just start by asking you, given the changes that you have seen or how well you know this person, do you have any sense of the timing yourself? This can be such important information for whoever is going to answer this question, whoever is going to have this question passed on to them, to know if the person asking the question is on the same page in terms of a likely prognosis, or if they are, wildly in a different place with hopes and expectations that are completely unrealistic. Okay, so you're really helping out the person who's going to have that question directed to them by getting that piece of information. Then additional exploratory questions might be, regarding the family vacation. So how would it be for you if your mom's condition declined while you were away? See, the whole decision of whether or not to take the vacation could turn on their answer to that question. What would that be like? They might say, we know that can happen and we'd be okay with it. Or, oh my gosh, oh no, 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 that would not be okay. Okay. To the woman whose grandchildren are visiting, you might say, so how important is it to have the grandchildren visit in person as opposed to, for example, online? And how long do you think it would take you to arrange that visit? Okay. Now, remember, this woman is actually not asking, how much longer does my husband have to live? When you explore, she's actually asking, how much longer will he be able to engage in a conversation with our grandchildren when they arrive from back east? That is a completely different question. And then to the woman who's asking if she can go home for a shower, the question that needs to be asked is, what would it be like for you, or how important is it for you to be present here when your husband dies? And she might say, oh, I miss my dad's death. I would be devastated if I missed my husband's death. Once you know the answer to that question, then you don't have to be the person who, with the best of intentions, says, you know what, you look tired, you need a break, just go home and get that shower. I'm sure everything will be fine. Don't be that person, because we know that things can change quickly. We know that sometimes people die when family leave. She has the right, all of these people have the right to make an informed decision. And asking these kinds of exploratory questions can be so helpful in giving them information they need to make their decision in their specific situation. And then after this additional exploring, the response still doesn't have to be a definitive statement, because it can also be factually true and very helpful to say something like, actually, given the nature of the illness, it's very difficult to say when someone will die. However, there are things that we can look for that, as part of the dying process, that can give us clues to how things are changing. For example, we can get useful information by looking at the way that a person has changed over the last weeks or days or hours, especially if those changes are part of a general pattern of decline. So we can keep assessing. We can't give you a specific time, but there are things we can look at and that you can look at with us that can help us continue to assess how things are changing and what that might mean. And then, while you're giving this useful piece of information, you might additionally say, in fact, I would really encourage you to say this, because making a prognosis can be so difficult. We often tell families, if there is something you need to do, if there is someone who needs to come, if there are things that need to be said, we advise you do it sooner rather than later, because sometimes things can change far more quickly than any of us could anticipate. I can't even tell you the number of times that I have seen this make a difference between a good death experience for a family and someone who's dying and a devastating experience, because people didn't know, and so they couldn't make an informed decision. And you think about, the grandchildren maybe getting 2 visits in. The family maybe not going on the holiday, but during that 2-week period being present when the mother dies, or the woman not getting a shower for maybe several more days, but not being devastated by missing her husband's death. So the point here is that by using verse, families can in fact get useful information to make their decisions without having their questions dismissed or without being given an answer that could very likely turn out to be wrong. So the final step in using verse is sharing. And sharing is about making sure that the team is aware of information that allows them to respond to people and situations more effectively and to improve care by gaining new perspectives on challenging situations, clarifying questions and concerns, better understanding the history and the motivations behind an individual's decisions or their reactions, and avoiding those crises that are caused by misunderstandings, inaccurate information, faulty assumptions, or personal biases. So that's verse. That's how it works. That's the rationale for how it works. And now I would like to open it up to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I just wanted to let everyone know that the Q&A function works for the questions. The chat is disabled, so if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to pop in the Q&A and we can go through that. Now, I apologize, I should have mentioned that earlier. I also am just going to make sure I can see. Okay. Oh. Okay, so the first question that came in is, what is the most common questions families ask?
They want to know what to expect. They want to know what they're seeing, what it means, particularly if they're seeing a change in someone's condition. They often want to know, what we would consider, the smaller issues. What are visiting hours? What food can we bring in? How many people can visit? How long can we stay? Can we bring our pets? So they have those questions, which may seem to us what we would categorize as minor questions. And then they have the bigger questions. But you know what? I'm glad you asked that, because it's up to us to create a question-friendly environment. So we set the tone for how we respond to questions. And what I think works best in healthcare settings is when we actually say to people, feel free to ask us questions about anything you're concerned about. In fact, if you Google a question prompt sheet in the context of healthcare settings, you will actually find a list of questions that in some healthcare settings, they actually hand to families. And it can go from those questions about kind of housekeeping things all the way down to how will you keep my loved one comfortable when they can no longer swallow? And the beauty of a question prompt list like that is somebody can look at that and go, what? They're going to stop swallowing? I didn't know that could happen. Could that happen now? And it gives you that perfect opportunity to say, you know what, we're not there yet, but yes, that can happen. So let's just keep that in mind. We'll let you know what we're seeing. But, if you start to see your dad or your mom having trouble, what you think is with their swallowing, feel free to ask us about it. So in a question-friendly environment, family members ask more questions. And the only other thing I'll say about that is, in a question-friendly environment, the team has to be on the same page how they answer. Okay, nobody can go rogue. Somebody can't go, oh, well, I'm going to give them my answer to that question, even though it's different from the team, because then that's like throwing a grenade, pulling the pin and throwing a grenade at a family and watching them blow up. So if you are going to answer questions, then the team needs to act as a team and provide consistency. So that's a very long answer to a very good question.
And then we just have another comment of someone saying the presentation was outstanding and they want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, a few thank yous coming in. People are really appreciating your time. Another question, how would you address, say a technical question comes up or something that you're not really too sure of the answer, or you want to confer with someone else before you answer? What do you think the best way to approach that would be?
Okay, so again, excellent. First of all, validate. Don't just walk away. Say that's a good question. Okay. I might not have the answer to it. I'm going to need to check with someone to get back to you about that. But that is a good question. That's a question we've been asked before. Whatever you can say, take that moment to validate, because that's what so rarely happens in healthcare, is people so rarely get their questions validated. Then it's perfectly okay to say, I need to get more information about that. This person will get back to you, but then don't drop the ball. Make sure that that happens. And in fact, be the person that goes back and say, so did you get a response that was helpful to you? Okay. Don't put another teammate into a bind by saying, oh, the nurse can give you a definite answer to that question, because that's not necessarily fair. But you can say, that's a question the nurse is probably better able to answer than I can. So I will check with her and we'll see what she can say.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. If there's any other questions, even after today's webinar that you come across, you can email the webinars at SafeCare BC email address, and I'd be happy to forward them along. I also just want to remind everyone that this webinar was recorded and it will be available on the Care for Caregivers website. And I also just wanted to bring attention to two webinars that are coming up. There will be on October 3rd will be flexible adaptation in relentless emergent and inevitable change, so change management on October 3rd, and then responding to crisis at work on October 12th. I want to take this time to thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here. We really, truly appreciate your expertise and you taking the time to, and there's so many thank yous coming in the comments, people saying they love the topic, they appreciate your time, they appreciate the presentation. Thank you everyone for taking your lunch hour. I know everyone has so much on their plate, but this was such a valuable and informative presentation. Truly appreciate it. And the recording will be up on the Care for Caregivers website, and any extra questions can be forwarded to the webinars at SafeCare BC, and we'll make sure we get them forwarded.
And you can feel free to give out my email address. That's fine too, when they do that.
Absolutely. Sounds great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Okay,
Elizabeth.
thanks. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.